I stood there in the lobby of the mountain hotel, surrounded by the warm scent of pine wood and the distant crackling of a fire that didn't belong to me. The suitcase at my side had started to lean like even it was tired of being ignored. My fingers clenched the handle until my knuckles ached, but I didn't move. I couldn't. My mother's words echoed in my ears louder than the soft jazz humming through the speakers overhead. There's no room for you. Dylan's taking it. He's important. You're not. She didn't whisper it. She didn't soften it. Just a cold, matter-of-fact declaration like she was telling me the weather. Her lips, painted in her usual muted rose shade, barely moved, but the sting landed with full force. I had paid for that room months ago, sent the money early, confirmed twice, even printed the damn confirmation email and tucked it into the side pocket of my bag just in case. But none of that mattered. Not to her. Not to any of them. I looked at her, expecting maybe some flicker of regret, even the tiniest flicker of hesitation. There was none. She adjusted the gold chain on her wrist, the one my father gave her on their 20th anniversary before he passed, and glanced toward the elevator like this conversation was just a speed bump in her perfectly curated weekend. Dylan flew in from New York, she said, her voice lowering slightly as if the geography explained everything. He's staying the whole week. You'll find somewhere else, I'm sure. There was the final flick of dismissal. I was 28, fully grown, and yet I stood there in front of my mother like a 10-year-old who had just been told her science project wasn't good enough to make the table display. But this was different. This wasn't a project. This was supposed to be my room. My space. My right. Behind me, a bellboy pushed a cart with gleaming wheels and suit bags draped over it like royalty. I stepped aside automatically, not wanting to be in anyone's way, not even as my own heart was being shoved aside without ceremony. Where should I go? I asked finally, my voice steadier than I expected. But it didn't matter. She wasn't listening anymore. I don't know, Laura. The lodge is fully booked, but maybe there's something in the village. Talk to the front desk. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask her how she could say that to me, how she could erase me so cleanly from her list of priorities. But I knew the answer. I'd always known it. Ever since I was little, my mother made it clear that usefulness was currency in our family. Dylan, with his tailored suits and perfect hair and business deals with Ryan, my sister's soon-to-be husband, was worth more than me. He contributed. He was a connection. I was a placeholder. A name on a family tree she couldn't quite prune away. The woman behind the reception desk smiled sympathetically, though I could tell she had overheard everything. She typed something quickly, eyes flicking to the screen and back to me. "I'm really sorry, miss," she said after a moment, "but it looks like we're completely full for the weekend." I nodded. Of course they were. Outside, the sky had started to bruise into that pre-evening violet, the kind that promised cold winds and slick roads. My coat was thin, not built for sudden exile, but I pulled it tighter around me and pushed the suitcase toward the doors anyway. I didn't cry. I think a part of me wanted to, but the tears wouldn't come. Not because it didn't hurt, God it did, but because this wasn't surprising. This wasn't new. I'd learned how to fold my pain into silent pockets a long time ago. I sat down on a wooden bench just outside the main doors, the cold seeping into my jeans, the metal handle of the suitcase still warm from my palm. For a while I just sat. The lights from inside the lobby spilled onto the snow-dusted stone path, and people walked by without seeing me, laughing, hugging, sipping hot drinks with whipped cream and sprinkles. I didn't blame them. I didn't even envy them. I just watched. I could still see her face. My mother. So composed. So unconcerned. Like she hadn't just told her daughter she wasn't worth a bed for the night. Like this whole thing was a minor inconvenience she'd already forgotten. But something shifted inside me then. Not an explosion, no fire or fury. Just a quiet, undeniable click. Like a gear turning for the first time after years of rust. I had spent my life trying not to make waves, not to be difficult or loud or needy. I had said yes when I meant no. I had smiled when I wanted to scream. I had stepped aside again and again, hoping that one day someone might notice the space I left behind. No more. Maybe I didn't know where I was going to sleep tonight. Maybe I didn't have a plan. But I knew this, I was done being invisible. I was done waiting for someone else, especially her, to make room for me. I pulled out my phone and started searching nearby inns, hostels, anything within 10 miles. My fingers trembled from the cold, but I didn't stop. I booked the cheapest room I could find, a converted barn with 1-star reviews and spotty heating. I didn't care. It was mine. I stood, lifted the suitcase again, and began walking toward the small village lights in the distance. The cold wind hit my face like a slap, but it also woke me up. Every step hurt, but every step also counted. Because this time I was walking toward something that belonged to me. And I wasn't going to let anyone take it away again. In the soft, gray mornings of Portland, While the city slowly stirred under the drizzle that never really left, I tied my apron behind my back, tucked my hair beneath a loose bun, and took my place behind the counter at the corner cafe that smelled like cinnamon, burnt espresso, and the lingering exhaustion of too many early shifts. I smiled at regulars, scribbled names on paper cups, and listened to half-finished podcasts through the tinny speakers. My name tag said Laura, but sometimes, it felt like that was the only thing about me that anyone ever remembered. I moved like clockwork. One pumped vanilla, almond milk, no foam, while my mind lived elsewhere. Somewhere deeper, warmer. A place with characters who fought back, who didn't apologize for existing, who took up space without flinching. Women who weren't waiting to be chosen or remembered or given permission. Women I wrote in the quiet hours of the night, when the streets outside my apartment blurred into black and the only sound was the distant hum of freight trains passing like ghosts. Under the name Claire Adair, I had published 3 novels. No agent, no deal, no press. Just PDF files uploaded to a self-publishing platform, a few downloads, and a handful of reviews from strangers who saw pieces of themselves in the heroines I created. No one in my life knew who Claire Adair was. She was mine alone. My escape, my rebellion, my truth. Sometimes, when I stood behind the counter handing out muffins and counting change, I imagined what it would feel like if someone looked at me and saw her instead. Not just the girl in the apron with soft-spoken thank yous, but the voice behind the words. But that never happened. Not in real life. Not in my family. At home, I was the one who didn't quite fit the frame. Amanda, my sister, she fit. She shone. She didn't just walk into a room, she claimed it. Her laugh was bright and effortless, her hair always perfect, her makeup never smudged. Even as kids, teachers remembered her name before mine. She was the one who won pageants and scholarships, who brought home shiny trophies and left me clapping on the sidelines. I wasn't jealous. I had learned early that there wasn't space for both of us to shine. So I shrank. Now she was marrying Ryan Travers, the son of the Travers family, the same Travers who owned half the skyline downtown, the ones with their name etched on buildings and invitations printed on cardstock thicker than my winter coat. The wedding was everywhere. A magazine-worthy affair with curated flower walls, string quartets, and seating charts that looked like architectural blueprints. Everyone was talking about it, the event of the season, the perfect union, the golden couple. And then there was me. The unnecessary seat at the table. The plus one with no plus. I wasn't even in the bridal party. She wanted to keep it small. My mother had said when I found out Amanda hadn't included me as a bridesmaid. Just her closest friends. You understand, right? Of course I understood. I always understood. It was my specialty. At family gatherings I was the quiet one, the helper. The one who offered to do the dishes or fetched more wine when the bottle ran low. Amanda told stories and everyone laughed. I listened. I blended. Not because I didn't have anything to say but because I had learned that no one wanted to hear it. When they talked about Amanda's wedding I smiled and nodded even when I wanted to scream. Even when I wanted to ask how they could plan a future for one daughter and forget that the other existed. But the truth was they hadn't forgotten me. They just didn't see me. Not the real me. Not the one who stayed up past midnight shaping stories about women who wouldn't be overlooked, who risked everything for freedom and love and purpose. They didn't see Claire Adair. They saw Laura the barista. The placeholder. I didn't blame Amanda. She was doing what she was raised to do, shine, impress, climb. I just wasn't sure who I was supposed to be anymore. The supportive sister? The invisible daughter? The failed writer with a drawer full of unsold dreams? Some nights after work I'd sit in my small apartment, legs curled under me, a chipped mug of tea going cold on the windowsill, and stare at the blinking cursor on my laptop screen. I'd reread passages from my books, lines that had poured out of me like breath, like blood, and wonder if they mattered to anyone but me. There were no fan letters, no royalties, no interviews. Just me and the women I wrote, broken, fierce, beautiful, and the quiet truth that, in some invisible way, they were all me. The apartment was modest, barely 2 rooms, but it held more of me than my mother's house ever had. There I didn't have to pretend. I didn't have to make small talk or wear the right dress or act like I wasn't tired of being overlooked. There I could be the version of myself that wasn't waiting for permission to matter. Still, the weight of being the one who didn't belong pressed in more during the weeks leading up to the wedding. Every phone call from my mother was about centerpieces or Amanda's gown or guest lists. Every visit home reminded me of how well Amanda fit into the life our family had built. How easily I slipped through its cracks. "You'll come early to help set up, won't you?" my mother asked during one of those calls, her tone already assuming I'd say yes. "It's just, you're so good with the little details." And I said yes. Of course I did. Because that's who I was to them. Helpful. Invisible. There to serve the story but never the main character. I closed the call and turned back to my laptop. The screen glowed in the dark and I started to type, the words coming in a rush I couldn't hold back. Another woman, another story. She was like me, unseen, uninvited, but not for long. And as the night slipped deeper and the city outside fell silent, I gave her the things I couldn't yet give myself. A voice. A space. A beginning. There's a hostel about half an hour from here, my mother had said, her voice light, almost helpful, as if offering me a ride to the airport instead of suggesting I disappear quietly out of sight. It's basic, but it'll do. For someone like you. Someone like me. The words hung in the air long after she turned back toward the elevator, back toward the warm-lit corridors of the hotel I had paid to stay in. I didn't argue. Not because I agreed, but because I was tired in that deep, bone-heavy way that sleep can't fix. There was no space for me there, and everyone had made that very clear. Dylan got the room. Amanda got the spotlight. My mother got the last word. And I got the 30-minute drive down winding roads to a hostel with a flickering sign and a rusted mailbox that leaned like it had given up trying to stand straight. I didn't expect much when I arrived, and the building delivered. The entryway smelled like boiled onions and old pine cleaner, and the receptionist barely looked up when I checked in, just slid a keycard across the counter with a sticky smile and a gesture toward the narrow staircase at the back. My room was on the 3rd floor, and by the time I made it up there my suitcase was sticking and my shoulder ached from dragging it over uneven steps. The room was small enough that I could stretch my arms and almost touch both walls. A single bed sat against the far corner, the mattress dipping slightly in the middle like too many people had already come and gone, each one leaving a quiet dent in the fabric. A plastic chair leaned against the desk, and above it, a window with a cracked spider webbing across the bottom corner. Cold air leaked in through the gap, and the thin curtain danced with every gust like it was trying to escape too. I stood for a moment just breathing in the silence. No one called after me. No one checked to see if I'd made it safely. It was always like this. I was used to it. But for some reason this time felt different. I sat down on the bed, then slowly leaned back until I was lying flat, staring up at the yellowed ceiling. The air was sharp with the scent of cleaning chemicals, but under it I could still smell the ghosts of everyone who had slept here before. Sweat, perfume, spilled beer, someone's lavender shampoo. My coat was still zipped up to my chin and my hands were red from the cold, but I didn't move. I just let it settle. The isolation. The rejection. The familiar weight of being unwanted. And then slowly something shifted. Not anger. Not tears. Just a quiet, steady thrum of something that had been buried under years of silence. I didn't cry. I thought I would, I thought I should, but the tears never came. Instead, my fingers reached for the side pocket of my bag, the one I always packed last. Inside was my old notebook, the soft leather frayed at the edges, and the pen I had used so often the brand name had rubbed off. I hadn't written by hand in months. There hadn't been time, or maybe I hadn't allowed myself to find it. The screen was easier, cleaner. But this felt right. More real. The page stared up at me, blank and open and forgiving. And then the words came. They didn't arrive gently. They poured out, a flood I couldn't stop even if I wanted to. My hand moved faster than my thoughts could catch up, scratching the page with lines that curved and crossed and bled ink through the paper. I wrote about her. A woman who had spent her whole life trying not to take up space, who apologized for her existence in the way she walked, the way she smiled, the way she always made herself smaller to let others pass. But something happened. One day the space she left behind stayed empty, and she realized no one ever noticed she was gone. And in that emptiness she found something unexpected. Power. Not loud, not fiery, but real. Quiet power. The kind that doesn't ask. The kind that simply is. She didn't run anymore. She didn't explain herself. She just stood. And slowly people began to notice. Not because she begged for their attention, but because she had stopped shrinking. I don't know how long I wrote. Hours maybe. The ink smeared under my hand, my fingers cramped, my back ached from hunching over the desk. But I didn't stop. Not until the words slowed into breath and I realized the sun had started to rise behind that cracked window. A soft light crept in, catching the frost on the glass and turning it gold. The curtain barely moved now. The air had gone still. I put the pen down. I hadn't cried. I hadn't begged. And for the first time in a very, very long while, I felt like myself. Not the forgotten daughter. Not the failed writer. Not the quiet one in the corner. Just me. A woman with words. A woman who had been pushed out and out and out, until she finally stepped into the only space left and claimed it as her own. It was small. It was cold. But it was mine. The morning of Amanda's wedding arrived wrapped in a brittle, unnatural stillness. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror in the hostel, the cold fluorescent light above humming steadily, washing my face in a pale, ghost-like hue. I pulled my hair back neatly, more out of habit than pride, and dressed in the one semi-formal outfit I owned, A navy blue dress with sleeves just long enough to cover the tension in my arms. I dabbed concealer beneath my eyes, but the shadows remained, softened only by resignation. I didn't expect to feel beautiful today. I only hoped to be invisible in a more elegant way. The drive back to the hotel was quiet, just the sound of tires whispering along the road and the occasional chirp of birds beginning to stir. My hand stayed firm on the wheel, but my stomach curled tighter with every mile, like it already knew what my heart refused to admit. I didn't belong here. Not really. When I arrived, guests were already gathering near the garden path, where rows of white chairs arched like ribs around the ceremonial altar. Everything looked like a page torn from a bridal magazine. Perfect lighting, perfect flowers, perfect timing. And there I was, trailing quietly behind the well-dressed crowd, like a misplaced comma in a sentence that didn't need editing. No one greeted me. No one noticed I had come. I found a seat near the back, just close enough to see Amanda's dress fluttering like a cloud near the altar, just far enough that I wouldn't ruin the pictures. Even during the vows, while Amanda's voice trembled in rehearsed tenderness and Ryan looked at her like he'd found the last star in the sky, I didn't feel bitterness. I felt absence. A hollow, familiar shape. Later, when the ceremony shifted into the reception, I followed the slow stream of guests into the ballroom, my heels clicking quietly on polished wood. I scanned the tables for my name and finally found it on a flimsy tent card at a table tucked beside the swinging kitchen doors, next to an elderly great-aunt who kept nodding off and a man who spent the entire dinner on his phone. Every few minutes, waiters rushed past us with trays of shrimp canapés and champagne flutes, the doors slamming open and shut behind them with mechanical rhythm. The scent of garlic and dishwater lingered around us like an afterthought. I watched the head table across the room, where Amanda sat laughing between courses, radiant and composed, her hand resting lightly on Ryan's arm. She hadn't looked at me once. Not when we entered, not during the speeches, not during the family photos where I stood on the very edge, partially cropped out by someone's wide-shouldered husband. Even then I smiled. Because I'd been trained to. Because it was expected. At some point during dinner, the conversation at my table turned to work. Real estate, finance, tech startups, nonprofits with seven-figure grants. The man beside me, something in property development, asked what I did. I write, I said simply, my voice steady, though I already knew what would follow. He blinked as though I'd spoken in a language no one else spoke anymore. Oh, he said, then nothing. Silence followed like a ripple spreading outward from a dropped stone. I didn't elaborate. I didn't defend it. I let the silence grow. Let it speak for all the times I had explained myself and found nothing on the other end but polite confusion or condescension. Let it hang like smoke until the conversation moved on without me. Amanda danced. With Ryan, with our mother, with the best man, with the wedding planner's assistant for a laugh. She spun in circles beneath the chandeliers, her dress sweeping the floor like a second skin. Not once did she come to me. Not once did she reach for my hand or pull me into her orbit like she had when we were little and she used to beg me to play her prince in dress-up games. I stayed at the table long enough to finish a glass of flat wine, then slipped away unnoticed, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses fading behind me as I stepped out onto the terrace. The cold hit me immediately, sharp and clean, biting through the thin fabric of my dress. I crossed my arms, standing still, letting my breath fog up in front of me. The night stretched out across the mountains in a deep, endless blue, and the stars blinked like they were trying to say something too far away to hear. I felt empty but not broken. Alone but not entirely lost. Maybe it was the distance from the noise, maybe it was the air, maybe it was the way silence feels like a balm after too much pretending. But in that moment I stopped trying to convince myself that I was fine. I wasn't. I was tired. I was worn down from years of making space for everyone else and finding none left for me. Behind me the music swelled. A slow jazz number, something Amanda loved. I thought about going back inside, thought about faking one more smile, pushing through one more hour of conversations that left no room for me. But then the terrace door creaked open. I didn't turn around at first, assuming it was someone needing a break, maybe a drunk groomsman sneaking a cigarette. But then I heard a voice, low, hesitant. I saw you during the ceremony, the voice said. You looked like you didn't want to be there. I turned. And for the first time in a very long while, someone was looking directly at me. Not through me. Not past me. At me. His expression wasn't pitying. It wasn't performative. It was real. Curious. Present. I didn't know what to say. I didn't need to. Because in the stillness of that moment, standing under the dark sky with music echoing behind us and the cold air softening everything sharp inside me, something shifted again. Not everything changed. But I had been seen. And for now that was enough. The wind had softened by the time I turned away from the edge of the terrace. My fingers were cold, but I didn't want to go back inside, not to the laughter, not to the glittering crystal glasses and the echo of my own absence. The light from the ballroom spilled through the glass doors, casting golden rectangles onto the stone floor, but I stayed just beyond it, wrapped in the chill like it was armor. I didn't hear him approach until he was standing beside me, not too close, but near enough that I could see the white cloth of his serving apron folded neatly at his waist and a tray still clutched in one hand. He looked younger than me, maybe mid-20s, with messy dark hair and eyes that carried something more than polite curiosity. He didn't speak right away and I didn't look at him fully, not until I realized he wasn't moving on. "You okay?" he asked, quiet, careful. I turned my head slightly, unsure whether to answer honestly or give the kind of smile people expect when they ask that question but don't really want the truth. "I'm fine," I said, but my voice betrayed me. It didn't carry conviction. It barely carried at all. He nodded, still not walking away. A moment passed and then he said, "I saw how they treated you." His voice wasn't sharp or pitying. It was calm. Simple. I blinked, surprised by the bluntness, and looked at him properly for the first time. He wasn't like the rest of them. His name tag read Jake. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows and there was a smudge of something, maybe wine, on the cuff of his shirt. But his gaze didn't flinch. "It's not my business," he added quickly, almost as if apologizing, "but I've been walking around all day refilling glasses, clearing plates, listening. It's hard not to notice things when people forget you're even there." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to nod, thank him, walk away before I got emotional. But another part, the part that had been unraveling slowly, piece by piece, ever since I was turned away from the hotel room that should have been mine, held still. "They don't even know I'm here," I said, and it came out lower than I expected. "Not really." He tilted his head slightly. "But you are." I gave a weak smile. "That's debatable." Jake was silent for a moment, looking past me to the trees that lined the dark slope beyond the terrace. Then he said something I wasn't prepared for. "You write, don't you?" I froze. "How do you know that?" "I overheard at your table," he replied, glancing sideways at me. "You told someone you write and they didn't say anything. But it stuck with me." I looked down at my hands. My nails were bare, my fingers still cold. I nodded once, quietly. "I do." "What kind of stories?" I hesitated, not sure how to answer. For years I had deflected that question. I usually said fiction. Or women's fiction. Or sometimes just novels. Safe words. Words that didn't lead to more silence or empty smiles. But something about Jake's tone made me pause. "Stories about women who stop hiding," I said eventually. "About women who've spent most of their lives folding themselves down so others can have more room. Until one day they don't." Jake nodded again, his expression serious. Then he looked at me in a way that wasn't casual, wasn't fleeting. It was full, focused. "You know," he said, "a story like that could change someone's life." I stared at him. For a moment I didn't move. The words landed so quietly and so completely, like water on dry earth. Not just kind, not just encouraging. True. Something inside me broke and mended in the same second. "I don't think anyone's ever said that to me before," I whispered. "They should have," he said without missing a beat. We stood there in silence for a few moments longer, the kind that doesn't demand anything, the kind that feels like space being made. Real space. Eventually he offered a quiet goodnight, gave me a small knowing nod and disappeared back through the doors, swallowed by the glitter and noise. I stayed a little longer, breathing slower now, his words circling in my chest like they were looking for a place to settle. Later that night, back in the hostel, I didn't turn on the lights. I moved through the dark on memory, sat at the small desk beneath the cracked window and pulled my notebook into my lap. The moonlight stretched long across the floorboards, thin and silver, and the room smelled faintly of old coffee and cold plaster. I opened to a new page. For the first time I didn't create a heroine with a different name or a different life. I didn't build her from pieces I wanted to be or places I'd never been. I wrote me. I wrote about the girl who stood in the corner of family photos, half cut from the frame. The woman who paid for a room she wasn't allowed to sleep in. The sister who clapped from the sidelines, the daughter who fetched wine, the writer no one listened to when she said, "I write." I wrote every silence, every moment of being passed over, every time I'd swallowed the urge to scream. I wrote her heartbreak and her refusal to let it be the end of her. I didn't write to prove anything. I wrote to exist. The words didn't stop. They came fast and breathless, sentences tumbling over each other, chapters blooming out of nothing. The story wasn't clean. It wasn't polished. But it was mine. I wasn't hiding behind a pseudonym. I wasn't fictionalizing the pain to make it easier to swallow. I was pulling it all into the light. And for the first time it didn't feel like weakness. It felt like truth. It felt like beginning. I didn't leave a note. Not because I wanted to make a statement but because I was done explaining myself to people who never really listened. I packed my bag in silence while the hotel ballroom echoed somewhere in the background with wedding toasts and clinking glasses, none of which were raised in my direction. I didn't check out at the front desk. I didn't wait for morning. I just walked out of that world as if it had never been mine, my steps quiet but certain, the air biting at my cheeks as I made my way to the nearest bus station. The idea to go to Seattle wasn't planned. It wasn't a dream I had scribbled into the margins of my notebooks or a city I had imagined as a home. It was simply somewhere else. Somewhere that wasn't here. I bought a one-way ticket at the counter with shaking hands, using the last of my savings, and didn't ask myself what came next. I didn't care. I just needed to begin again in a place where no one knew my name and no one had already decided what I was worth. The city welcomed me with rain. Not the angry kind, but a soft, persistent drizzle that blurred the windows of the bus and made the streets look like watercolor paintings, gray and green and endlessly alive. I found a room through a handwritten flyer taped to the window of a laundromat. Room available. Shared kitchen. Month to month. It was small, just enough space for a bed, a desk, and a chipped wardrobe with one broken handle, but the window overlooked a quiet alley filled with ivy and the distant sound of wind chimes. I signed the lease in pencil and moved in the same night, unpacking my life into drawers that smelled of cedar and old soap. For a week, I survived on canned soup and coffee, my notebook always within reach, the pages filling with stories that now felt sharper, hungrier. I walked the streets in the early mornings, following the steam rising from manholes and counting job posters stapled to bulletin boards. I applied everywhere, anywhere that would have me, and within days I had 2 jobs. In the mornings, I poured coffee at a neighborhood cafe with mismatched mugs and jazz playing on a dusty record player in the corner. In the evenings, I shelved books at a secondhand bookstore that smelled like ink and nostalgia, the kind of place where time felt slower and more forgiving. It was in that bookstore on a Thursday night that everything changed. They hosted weekly poetry readings in the back room, a space with string lights strung across the ceiling and chairs arranged in messy circles. People brought tea in thermoses and wore scarves indoors. It wasn't fancy, but it was honest. It felt like a secret world I had always known existed but had never been invited into. You'll know. The owner, a woman named Margaret with ink-stained fingertips and a voice like gravel, encouraged me to read. She had seen me scribbling in my notebook between shifts and, without asking questions, handed me a slot in the lineup. "You've got something to say," she said, and walked away before I could argue. That night, I stood at the front of the room with my palms sweating and my voice trembling just enough to make the paper shake. I had never read my writing out loud before. Not once. I had always imagined it would make the words feel smaller, thinner. But as I began to speak, softly at first, then louder, the opposite happened. The room didn't just listen. It leaned in. I read a passage from the new piece I'd been writing. A story about a woman who disappears from her family's narrative, only to rewrite her own line by line, in a city where no one expects her to be anything but herself. It was raw. It was uncomfortable. But it was mine. And when I finished, there was silence. Not the kind that follows disinterest, but the kind that follows weight. And then applause. Real, unfiltered human applause. A few claps at first, then more, until the sound wrapped around me like something solid. After the reading, people approached me. Some said thank you. Others shared pieces of their own stories, fragments of themselves they saw reflected in mine. I stood there, overwhelmed, but for the first time I didn't feel small beneath it. I felt steady. And then he approached. He looked familiar. Not in the way you recognize a face, but in the way you recognize a feeling. He was tall, with hands tucked deep in his coat pockets and eyes that held something quiet and deliberate. He waited until the others had moved on before stepping closer, not imposing, just present. "I don't usually come to these," he said, his voice calm and low. "But I'm glad I did tonight." I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded, my notebook still pressed against my chest like a shield. "What you read," he continued, "it wasn't just good. It was true." His words didn't flatter. They didn't try to impress. They just were. And that made them land even harder. I started, unsure whether to say my name or thank him or apologize for looking stunned. He smiled just slightly. "You don't need to explain anything. Just keep writing." Then he handed me a card, simple, clean, with only a name and an email, and walked away, the sound of the bell above the door marking his exit. I stood there long after the others had gone, the room half empty, the string lights dimmed. I didn't know who he really was or why his words struck like they did. But I knew this. Something had shifted again. Not like before. This was deeper. I had run away without a map, expecting nothing, wanting only escape. But in the quiet of this city, in a second-hand bookstore with creaking floors and mismatched chairs, I had found the beginning of something I hadn't dared to imagine. A version of myself I had never met before. One that didn't ask to be seen. One that simply was. I didn't expect to see him again. 4 days after the poetry reading, his voice echoed in my mind. The quiet certainty of his words, the weight they carried, and the strange, steady warmth they left behind. I kept his card tucked into the back of my notebook not because I planned to use it, but because it felt like proof that something real had happened, that I hadn't imagined it. But it was only a few days later, during my evening shift at the bookstore, that he returned. The bell over the door chimed, and I looked up from behind the counter, half expecting another regular searching for a tattered copy of a forgotten novel. But there he was, coat slightly damp from the rain, hair mussed by the wind, a quiet smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Hi," he said simply, as though this were just a continuation of our last conversation, as though the days between us hadn't stretched taut with questions. I blinked, caught between recognition and disbelief. "Hi. I hope this isn't weird," he said, stepping forward, "but I'd like to buy you a coffee. There's a place around the corner, quiet, no rush. I have something I think you should hear." There was no pressure in his voice. No performative charm. Just calm intention. I hesitated only for a moment before nodding. The cafe was small, with soft lighting and the kind of warmth that comes from steamed milk and old brick walls. We sat by the window and he ordered 2 coffees without asking what I wanted, as if he already knew, and somehow he was right. It arrived the way I always drank it, black with a splash of oat milk. He waited until the first sip before speaking. "My name's Alexander West," he said, setting his cup down with care. "I run a small publishing house based out of Seattle. Maybe you've heard of it, Glass House Books." I had. Of course I had. Anyone in the literary world knew the name. They published sharp, uncompromising fiction, stories that carved their way into the heart. The idea that he was connected to it, let alone ran it, left me breathless. "I've been reading your work," he continued, "for almost 2 years now." I froze. He reached into the satchel at his side and pulled out a worn paperback copy of one of my novels. The one I'd almost taken down from the self-publishing platform because I thought it was too personal, too raw. The cover was creased, the pages slightly bent at the corners. It had been read. Really read. "I found it by accident," he said. "Late one night looking for something else. I stayed up until morning reading it. Then I looked for the others. Clara Dare. That was the name you used." I didn't speak. I couldn't. My throat was tight and I could feel the pressure behind my eyes building, but I forced it down. "I've read a lot of voices," he said. "But yours doesn't try to impress. It doesn't posture. It tells the truth even when it hurts. And I think it's time people heard that voice." He paused, letting the words land before continuing. "I want to offer you a contract. A full series if you're willing. We'll start with your existing work and build from there. I think your stories can do more than just exist quietly. I think they can take up space. The kind they deserve." For a long time I said nothing. I sat there holding my coffee with both hands as if it might keep me from floating away. My entire life I had imagined what it might feel like to be seen. Not politely acknowledged, not indulged, but truly, unmistakably seen. And here, in a quiet cafe on a rainy evening, a man I barely knew was handing me the validation I had spent a lifetime believing was just out of reach. "Why me?" I asked finally, my voice small. He looked at me, really looked. "Because you already know what it feels like to be invisible. And still you chose to write. That kind of voice matters." We stayed for hours after that. The conversation moved from stories to childhood memories to the strange rhythm of grief and the way silence can shape a person more deeply than noise ever could. He listened without interrupting. When he spoke, it was thoughtful, never performative. There was no angle, no mask. At some point, the sky turned black and the cafe emptied. But we remained, 2 cups long since drained, the air between us full of something soft and quiet and blooming. I hadn't realized how long I'd been holding my breath around other people until I felt it leaving my body in steady, even waves. Later, as we stepped outside into the cool air, he walked beside me without speaking, his presence calm, grounding. Just before we reached the bookstore, he paused. "Laura," he said, using my real name for the first time, "you don't have to hide behind a story anymore. Not unless you want to." It wasn't just a compliment. It wasn't even an offer. It was a truth. A mirror held up to a part of myself I had never dared to believe was real. And in that moment, for the first time in my life, I felt it. Unmistakable, quiet, powerful. I was seen. And perhaps slowly I was beginning to be loved. The book I began that night in the hostel, the one I wrote with cold fingers and a spine made of truth, found its way into the world like a quiet revolution. It wasn't supposed to happen the way it did. I thought maybe a few readers would discover it by accident the way Alexander had discovered me. I thought it might live a small, meaningful life in the hands of people who needed it, who recognized the voice hidden inside it as something close to their own. But it didn't stay small. Within weeks of its release, something shifted. The quiet hum around it grew louder. Readers began to write. Messages arrived at all hours, long aching paragraphs from women who saw themselves on every page, who had never felt seen until they read my words. Bookstores sold out. The second printing vanished faster. And then somehow it hit the list. The one that measures something you can't control. Popularity, momentum, the swell of voices rising behind your name. It became a bestseller. And with that came everything I never expected. Invitations, spotlights, stages. I was asked to speak on podcasts where I'd once only been a listener, sit on panels with authors I had admired from the far side of a screen, give readings in packed rooms where every pair of eyes stayed fixed on me, not with scrutiny but with hunger. They wanted the truth. And I had lived it. Still, through it all, I stayed quiet about the parts that weren't meant for everyone. I protected the silence that had shaped me. I gave pieces of myself on pages and podiums, but the rest I kept close, guarded like a sacred thing. Especially my love for Alexander. What we had wasn't flashy or performative. It grew like ivy, steady, persistent, private. We moved through the city like two people who had nothing to prove, our days filled with books and quiet dinners, long walks through neighborhoods where no one knew us, where we could exist without the weight of names. At night, he would read drafts over my shoulder, his hand resting on my back like punctuation, steadying me. He never tried to shape my words. He just held the space for them. We didn't hide each other, not out of shame but out of respect. What we had wasn't a brand. It was real. And in the world I had come from, where attention often meant dissection, I had no interest in making our love another headline. But secrets don't always stay silent. It began with a photograph. A grainy image snapped through the window of a small cafe, the one we always went to after readings. Then a name. Caption. A headline. The article didn't ask for permission. It simply claimed. Author Clara Dare and publishing mogul Alexander West. The hidden romance behind the bestseller. Suddenly the story wasn't mine anymore. The phones didn't stop. My email filled with press requests, questions, speculation. Friends forwarded links I didn't want to see. Strangers dissected us as if we were characters in someone else's book. As if love could be measured by how well it fit into a headline. Alexander stayed calm. He always did. Let them talk, he said. We know what's real. And I believed him. But the noise still pressed in, an echo I couldn't silence. It was late one evening when my phone rang. An unknown number. A voice I hadn't heard in a long time. I knew it before I answered. The past doesn't always knock. It lets itself in. Laura. The name wrapped around me like a thread pulling tight. My mother. For a moment I couldn't speak. I watched the city outside my window, the lights glowing like tiny fires, and waited for my voice to return. I saw the news, she said finally, not pausing long enough for me to respond. I read the book too. Your sister sent it. You didn't even change our names. I had. Slightly. Just enough. She laughed, a low, sharp sound. You always were dramatic. I closed my eyes, the memory of being 19 and silent at dinner, of standing in a hotel lobby with my suitcase at my feet, rushing back like a flood I thought I had outrun. You were wrong, I said, not angrily, but with a stillness that had taken me years to earn. There was a pause. A hesitation. Then quieter, maybe I was. The line didn't go dead. It just stayed open. No apology. No congratulations. Just the hum of static and the sound of a door I had long since stepped through swinging open again. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence speak. Because this time I didn't need her to fill it. The call came from a number I didn't recognize, but I knew where it was from the moment I saw the area code, Colorado. For a second I stared at the screen, motionless, as if not answering might undo its existence. But I answered anyway, out of instinct, not intention. And just like that, the silence of 16 months cracked open. Laura. Her voice hadn't changed. It still carried that clipped sharpness, that performative calm barely masking the constant low boil of judgment. I didn't say anything and she didn't wait. I hope you're satisfied, she began, skipping any form of greeting, as if pleasantries were beneath the urgency of her outrage. Do you know what you've done? What you've made us look like? Her anger wasn't unfamiliar. It was the same tone she used when I forgot to smile in family photos, when I wore sneakers instead of heels, when I didn't pretend to enjoy being invisible. 16 months, she snapped, and not a word. And now this. That book. Those interviews. The things you said, people are calling us. Do you understand that? Calling. Asking questions. You've humiliated us. I listened, letting the waves crash. You made it sound like we abandoned you. Like we didn't give you everything. Your sister cried. Your father, if he were alive. Don't, I said quietly, my voice cutting in like a clean blade. That stopped her. For a moment all I could hear was her breath, tight and indignant. Then came the reason for the call, the demand carefully wrapped in self-righteousness. "I heard you're engaged. Is it true?" she asked as though confirming gossip. I said nothing. "Well," she continued, "you're going to invite us, obviously. We're still your family. And you owe us at least that." I could almost hear her adjusting her bracelets, the way she always did when she was pretending to be calm. I imagined her standing in her kitchen, expensive countertops gleaming behind her, outrage masked as maternal concern. "You owe us an explanation," she said. "An apology." That was when something inside me stopped bending. "No," I said. The word was small. Irrevocable. She laughed once, disbelieving, almost amused. "No, that's it. After everything." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't match her tone. I just spoke. "You want an explanation? Fine. Let me give you one." I stood then, pacing slowly to the window, the city lights blurring behind the glass, the weight of years pressing behind my ribs like a dam ready to break. "I was the one with no room," I said. "Do you remember that? I had a reservation. I paid. And you handed it over without hesitation to someone who didn't even know my name. Guess he was important. And I was not. You're being dramatic." "I'm not finished," I said, firm now. "You sat me at a table next to the kitchen and you didn't see a problem. I stood in the background of every photo. Amanda danced with everyone but me. And you acted like that was normal. Laura, it was a wedding." "No," I said again. "It was years. Years of being treated like I didn't matter. Not just that day. Every day. You saw what you wanted to see. You celebrated what made you look good. And when I didn't fit that image, you edited me out. Quietly. Efficiently. I was convenient when I was quiet, when I was useful, when I didn't ask for more." I stopped, breathing in, holding the silence. I wrote about it because it was the truth. Because for the first time in my life I told the truth. And you know what? People understood. Strangers saw me more clearly than my own mother ever did. She didn't speak. I let the pause sit between us, a hollow space I no longer needed to fill. "And no," I said, calmer now. "You won't be invited to the wedding. You weren't there when I needed you. You don't get to show up now that there's something to celebrate. You don't get a seat in a life you refuse to see." Another breath. Still silence. "I'm done performing for you. I'm done chasing approval that always came with conditions. This is not anger anymore. It's freedom." There was a sound, maybe a sharp inhale, maybe just disbelief. I didn't wait. I ended the call. And for the first time truly I knew it wasn't a pause. It wasn't a break. It was an ending. The sky over the bay was soft with mist that morning, the kind that blurs edges gently, making the world feel wrapped in silk. The air smelled of salt and cedar, and the breeze carried the low rhythmic hush of water meeting land, again and again, like a promise whispered on repeat. I stood barefoot on the deck of the small pier where we had set up the ceremony, my dress swaying with the wind, simple and linen, nothing heavy, nothing borrowed, just mine. There were no chandeliers. No designer chairs or choreographed photo ops. There was driftwood shaped into an arch and a line of wildflowers gathered from the nearby cliffs by friends who knew what I loved. Nothing curated, nothing trimmed. Just what grows when you leave it alone. The guest list was short and exact. People who had chosen me not out of obligation or blood but out of love. Friends from the bookstore. Readers who had traveled across states just to witness the day. Writers I'd met at panels who had once been strangers and now felt like pieces of home. Margaret was there in her black boots and smoky laugh, sitting in the front row with her chin high like she'd always known I'd end up here. Even Jake flew in all the way from New York, his suit wrinkled from travel, eyes wide with the kind of pride that didn't need to be spoken aloud. He gave me a hug that felt like a full circle quietly closing. No camera crews. No press. No expectations. Just belonging. Alexander stood at the end of the aisle, not in a tuxedo, but in a navy shirt with sleeves rolled to his forearms, the way he always wore them. His smile was not grand or theatrical. It was the steady, certain kind. The kind that tells you the ground beneath your feet isn't going anywhere. I looked at him and felt no nerves, only quiet. Only right. Before the ceremony began, I stepped away for a moment just to breathe. Just to feel it all. The gravel crunched under my heels as I walked toward the edge of the trees where the view widened and the city shimmered in the distance, faint and far. My heart beat slowly with the rhythm of someone who knows she isn't being watched. I had waited my entire life for that kind of stillness. That's when one of the security staff walked toward me, his face apologetic but firm. "Just letting you know," he said gently, "there's a woman and a younger guest trying to get past the checkpoint. Said their family. Said it was urgent. I didn't ask who. I didn't need to. My chest stayed calm. Do you want to speak to them?" I shook my head. No. Please ask them to leave. He nodded without question. No drama followed. No shouting. No public confrontation. Just a quiet decision carried out with quiet certainty. That's what this day was. Quiet. Certain. Right. When I returned to the pier, the music had started. A single cello playing something soft and unfamiliar but warm. I stepped onto the path lined with seagrass and candles in jars, not escorted by anyone, not handed over like a possession, just walking fully and simply as myself. Every face I passed smiled at me not because of what I represented, but because of who I was. I reached Alexander and took his hands. There were no vows read from paper, only words we had written together the night before. No performance. No traditions borrowed from families that had never made room for me. Just the truth, spoken with our eyes and our breath and our hands wrapped around one another like we were anchoring each other in this life. When we kissed, there was no applause, no dramatic cue. Just the sound of the sea and laughter and someone crying softly behind me, moved not by spectacle but by honesty. Later, under strings of lights in the open sky, we danced not a rehearsed dance but whatever moved us. We ate pie instead of cake. People read poems. Someone played guitar. At one point I sat with Jake and we talked about how strange it was, the shape of life, the way it folds and folds until finally you fit. No one talked about the family that wasn't there. No one asked. Their absence wasn't tragic. It was peaceful. It was the empty chair you stop saving when you finally accept that not everyone is meant to join you at your table. That night, as the stars emerged one by one, I looked around at the people gathered, holding glasses, barefoot on the sand, their voices easy and free. And I felt it fully, not a trace of guilt, not a question left unanswered. This was my wedding. Not built for tradition. Built for truth. And in every moment of it, I belonged entirely to myself. It began quietly as most things from my past did. A blog post, then a social media thread, then a local interview somewhere in Colorado where a familiar voice painted herself the victim of a daughter who had forgotten where she came from. They didn't name me outright at first. But the timing was obvious, the language unmistakable. It didn't take long for my name to surface, tied to phrases like betrayal, ungrateful, estranged. They used the word abandoned more than once. They called me the daughter who wrote lies. They called my book a manipulation. They called my silence cruel. The spread. From page to page, post to post, until even publications that had once interviewed me with admiration began adding question marks to their headlines. The ones who didn't know me, who hadn't stood with me barefoot on the bay, who hadn't seen the empty chair I had finally stopped setting, began speculating. Spinning stories. Some made me a villain. Others, a tragic figure in a fractured family drama. No one asked what was true. I could have responded. I could have defended myself. I could have told them about the night I stood in a hotel lobby with a suitcase and no key. I could have recounted every Christmas dinner where my voice was talked over, every celebration where my name was left off the list, every silence that stretched longer than any argument. I could have laid it all bare, detailed and brutal and undeniable. I had the words. I had the truth. But I didn't use them. Because I had already written the story that mattered. Because I had stopped living for approval the day I walked away from a table where I was only ever meant to serve the backdrop. Because their noise, loud as it was, could no longer reach the part of me that had finally learned to be still. I didn't need to win the narrative. I already had a life. A real one. In our kitchen, morning sunlight spilled across the floor while Alexander read the paper in his socks, mouthing parts of my old poems under his breath like lyrics he couldn't forget. Our bookshelves grew heavier with each passing month, filled not only with the works I had written, but with the ones I had once read for courage. Letters arrived from readers who thanked me not for being flawless, but for being honest. For telling the truth when it was hard. For writing women who didn't need redemption arcs, only space. The media campaign dragged on, desperate in its crescendo. Each headline louder than the last. But it became background noise. Static. Something distant and hollow, like a radio playing in a room I no longer entered. Some mornings people would forward me the latest interview or message assuming I needed to see it. I didn't. Because I wasn't the woman from before. I was no longer a daughter waiting for a place at someone else's table. I was the writer who built her own. I was the woman who stood where she chose, with people who saw her not as a symbol of failure or rebellion, but simply as herself. I was not the scandal. I was not the apology. I was not the story they tried to tell. I was the one who wrote my own. And in that story, happiness was not a weapon. It was my proof. Came like most things do when you've stopped looking over your shoulder. Quietly, unexpectedly, and with just enough weight to pause the breath. I was sitting at the cafe around the corner from our apartment, editing the last chapter of a new manuscript, when the headline flashed across the small mounted television in the corner. It wasn't even the words that caught me first. It was the photo. A familiar jawline, a tailored suit, and the kind of smug half-smile that once graced the glossy pages of wedding brochures and charity galas. Ryan Travers. Under investigation for fraud, embezzlement, corporate deception. The words tumbled over the screen like dust pulled off a curtain that had been closed too long. I didn't move. I watched the anchor speak, her voice measured, almost curious. Details followed: frozen assets, shuttered offices, federal subpoenas. It wasn't speculation. It was collapse. One that had clearly been building for years, hidden beneath champagne glasses and magazine spreads, behind curated smiles and carefully chosen words. They hadn't just lost money. They had lost the image. The Travers name, the business empire, the house that had stood like a monument to perfection. It was all crumbling. And at the center of it was the family I had once tried so hard to belong to, the sister who had danced through life like it was a stage, and I was the forgotten prop left behind the curtain. I read every line, every quote, every thread of the story unraveling in real time. Amanda's name appeared briefly, no comment, was not available for an interview, but I could imagine the silence. The carefully calculated retreat. The headlines didn't blame her. Not yet. But I knew how quickly the narrative could shift. Especially when the facade fell too hard too fast. My phone buzzed. A message from a friend linking the article. Then another. Then a third. Everyone wanted to know if I'd seen it. If I had thoughts. If I felt anything. And I did. But not the way they expected. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel anything sharp or loud or triumphant. I just felt still. Because this wasn't my fire to put out. This wasn't my storm to brace against. It never had been. They had built that life themselves, brick by brick, on image and ambition and the unspoken rule that looking perfect mattered more than being honest. They had chosen that world over and over again, even when it meant cutting me out, even when it meant pretending I was never standing there waiting to be seen. They had chosen silence when I needed a voice. They had chosen strangers over daughters. They had chosen appearances over truth. And now the world was simply catching up. I didn't call Amanda. I didn't send an email or a message or a condolence hidden in half sentences. I didn't check on my mother. I didn't reach for anyone whose absence had taught me the weight of my own worth. Not because I was cruel. Not because I didn't remember what it felt like to fall. But because I had learned the difference between being compassionate and being pulled back into someone else's chaos. This was not a moment for revenge. This was not a victory. It was just a truth surfacing. And I had spent too many years being buried under other people's versions of truth to confuse the two. So I closed the tab. I finished my chapter. I took another sip of coffee, still warm in my hand, and turned my face toward the window where the afternoon sun was breaking through the clouds, steady and golden with nothing to prove. I had chosen my life. They had chosen theirs. And finally those choices were no longer tangled. The envelope was plain, almost too plain, off-white, hand-addressed, no return stamp. It sat on the edge of the kitchen table for nearly an hour before I opened it, as if something in its weight warned me that whatever was inside wasn't meant to be rushed. The handwriting was familiar. I hadn't seen it in years, but I would have recognized the slant of it anywhere. The precise loop of the L, the way she pressed too hard with the pen as though trying to leave a dent deeper than ink could hold. There was no salutation. No, dear Laura. Just a pause at the top of the page, a breath in paper. I didn't see you, she wrote. Not really. And not because you weren't there. But because you never demanded it. You didn't scream. You didn't fall apart in public. You didn't push your way into the room. You stood back. And I mistook that for strength I didn't need to worry about. My fingers tightened around the edge of the page. You were easy to forget, she wrote, not because you lacked anything, but because I never stopped to ask why you were always the one stepping aside. I was proud of Amanda because she mirrored everything I wanted the world to see. But you. There was a long scratch across the next sentence, a line of words she had written and then thought better of. When the writing resumed, it was smaller. You didn't make it about you. And I never realized that was the kind of strength I should have been proud of. I read it slowly, the way one touches a scar they thought had healed. There was no bitterness in her tone this time. No righteousness. Just a strange, unpolished honesty that I had never expected to hear from her. I'm sorry, she wrote. 2 words. Alone in their own paragraph. No explanation, no pleading. Just apology. I know it doesn't undo anything. And I don't expect a reply. But I wanted you to know I've been reading your words. All of them. The books, the interviews, even the ones that hurt to recognize. And I see you now. I really do. I'm late. I know that. But I'm here. That was it. No signature. No closing line. Just silence that followed more gently than any silence from her ever had. I folded the letter and placed it back into the envelope. My hands didn't shake, but they lingered over the paper longer than necessary. I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel undone. What I felt was quieter, harder to name, a shifting somewhere deep in the place where the oldest wounds had long since gone numb. It didn't erase the years. It didn't undo the nights I'd spent alone, asking myself what I had done wrong to be so easily dismissed. It didn't soften the memory of standing in that lobby with my suitcase while she looked past me. But it was something. A fracture. A thread pulled from a knot that had always felt permanent. I didn't write back. Not yet. Forgiveness isn't an instant. It's a slow undoing. A quiet loosening of what's been held too tightly for too long. I wasn't ready to give her that. But for the first time I saw the road ahead, not as a wall but as a path I might walk someday, barefoot and cautious, with no promise of where it leads. I placed the letter in the drawer beside my desk. Not hidden. Just there. Waiting. Like something not gone. Just not yet answered. The evening light draped itself over the sound like silk, soft, gold-touched and impossibly quiet. From the balcony, I could see the ripples stretching outward toward the horizon, broken only by the occasional passing ferry or the glint of a sailboat catching the last wind of the day. The air smelled faintly of salt and distant pine, and somewhere below wind chimes whispered against each other like a secret passed from hand to hand. I stood there barefoot, the wooden planks cool beneath my soles, one hand resting gently over the roundness of my belly, the other wrapped around a mug of lukewarm tea I hadn't finished drinking. The child inside me shifted, just a small movement like a flutter but enough to anchor me fully in the moment. My fingers moved instinctively, cradling that space where a new life had begun without ceremony, without apology. A life that would never know the silence I had grown up inside. A life I had chosen freely. Behind me, the house glowed with the warm light of late afternoon, the scent of dinner in the air, quiet music playing from another room, and the soft hum of Alexander's voice as he spoke to someone on the phone, laughing low and easy. There was no performance in our home. No pretending. No need to be anything more than we already were. The walls were lined with books, photos, memories built with both hands and time. We didn't display perfection. We lived in presence. We lived in truth. I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who stood in other people's stories as an afterthought, the one who folded herself smaller every time a voice louder than hers took the room. I thought about the years I spent mistaking silence for safety, invisibility for peace. I remembered the chill of that hostel window, the ache of standing at the edge of family photos, the sound of my mother's voice when it said, "Someone like you." That version of me was still there, somewhere buried beneath layers of choices and change, but she no longer defined me. She had led me here, and for that I would always hold her close, but gently, like something fragile that no longer needed to break. I wasn't surviving anymore. I wasn't writing in the dark just to hear myself speak. I wasn't waiting to be seen. I was living. Fully. I was loved. Not for what I gave, not for how I performed, not for how small I made myself to make room for others, but for who I was as I was. And now there was life growing inside me. New, unnamed, and completely mine. I watched the sky shift into that perfect lavender dusk, the kind that only happens near water. A bird passed overhead, quiet and sure, its wings steady against the wind. I closed my eyes, breathed in deep, and let the stillness settle. This wasn't a chapter. This wasn't an ending. This was now. And it belonged entirely to me.